Last New Year's, me and my two best friends decided it would be fun to get together and rent out a house for the night. We weren't big on going to huge parties, but just enjoyed hanging out among our small group. Also, all of us lived in dorm rooms, so having a house to ourselves for once sounded like a great time, even without partying. My friend Jason rented out an Airbnb on the outskirts of the town we were in. I carpooled with my other friend Christian, and we met Jason there on New Year's Eve around noon. This place was more of a cabin than a normal house, being all wood and having the typical cabin features. There were other similar-looking cabin houses around, but they all had a decent spacing between them, so it kind of felt like we were out there alone. The inside wasn't as great, but this was one of the cheaper places available, so none of us were expecting luxury. We spent the day just hanging out in the living room and talking, and around 6, Christian went out to the store to grab some snacks and drinks. During this time, Jason and I were still sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. We looked at each other in surprise, knowing it was really weird for anyone to be out here and knocking on the door to an Airbnb. I got up and looked out the peephole, seeing some guy standing on the doorstep. I noticed the door had one of those metal latches on it, so I flipped it over and opened the door just enough to see them. I wouldn't usually answer the door to a random guy, but being in someone else's house, I wasn't sure if maybe it was the host or something. The guy looked at me, and I was instantly aware of his displeased look. He seemed angry about something, and it became more blunt when he opened his mouth. He told me in a disrespectful and stubborn tone that we needed to be quiet tonight and not disturb the entire neighborhood. The way he said it was almost threatening, and as if we'd already been making noise, but we hadn't even done anything loud, nor were we planning to. All the houses were so far apart. Even if he was a neighbor, there's no possible way he'd hear anything unless we were lighting up fireworks or something. I really wasn't in the mood to argue, so I just said sure and closed the door in his face. But not even a second later, he banged on the door again. I ignored him that time, making a face at Jason like this guy was crazy. We heard him leave after a moment, and when Christian got back, we told him about the encounter, and he almost didn't even believe us. The next 3 hours went by quick as we watched a movie and played some games on Jason's Switch. Then come almost midnight, we heard something outside. It sounded like someone dropping something on the ground, and a few seconds later, the piercing sound of glass shattering came from right outside the door. All of us stood up and ran to look out the window, seeing that same guy from earlier standing by Christian's car, which now had glass covering it from his shattered windshield. The guy was holding a metal baseball bat and looked like he was in some psychotic state, pacing around and just going crazy. Christian was pissed, going to the door and storming outside to confront him. Both Jason and I went to stop him, but before we even got to the doorway, a gunshot echoed through the cabin. I stopped in place, knowing what had likely happened, but it almost felt like a miracle when I saw Christian sprint back inside and lock the door behind him. A few more shots went off, hitting the side of the cabin, and followed by the man swinging the bat against the front door. Then, just as suddenly as it all started, the man just ran away. After an investigation, it was found that he wasn't even one of the neighbors of the Airbnb. Nobody seems to know who he was or where he lived, or even why he went absolutely insane. It was just an incredibly dangerous, unpredictable encounter that almost took our lives. A few weeks ago, I went on a trip where I rented out an Airbnb townhouse. I was staying in a small town that was near some trails I wanted to hike. I'd never been there before, or really had any idea of the place I was staying. I just knew it was a relatively small town that was in a convenient area for me. The drive took 9 hours total, so by the time I got to the Airbnb, it was getting late. It was on a street that had multiple other townhouses on it, but once I found it, I parked on the road and got my things up to the door. The place looked decent on the outside, definitely not very new or anything, but nothing that I wasn't already expecting. I texted the owner to let them know I'd made it, since I didn't see a passcode to the door anywhere in my emails. I waited for a couple of minutes, just standing there and looking out at the street. Then, I heard a door open nearby, and a man walked around the corner with a smile on his face. He greeted me as the Airbnb host, then let me into the place and said he'd be right next door if I needed anything. I wasn't expecting that, but he at least left quickly and didn't make anything too weird. I set up my things in the bedroom and had a look around the house, and I went to bed soon after. The next day, I ate a quick breakfast, then drove out to a trail and hiked it for a good 4 hours. I got back to the townhouse at 7 hours, but when I entered, something felt different. Some of the things in my room were off, like they'd been moved slightly. Nothing that I know of was missing, but I don't know. I just had a feeling it had been tampered with. Aside from my unevidenced suspicions, though, there really weren't any other things to actually prove someone had been inside while I was gone. After looking around for 30 minutes, I was more sure that this was me just being nervous about staying in an unfamiliar area. I forgot about it and heated up a frozen meal, then ate dinner on the couch while watching YouTube on my phone. At 11 p.m., I went to bed. This was a single-story townhouse, so the bedroom was at the end of the main hallway opposite the front door. I was always used to sleeping upstairs, so it was a little hard to get comfortable. As I laid in bed and tried to sleep, I kept falling asleep for a few minutes, then waking up and repeating this process. But then maybe an hour into the night, I was laying there awake, waiting to go back to sleep, when I heard something from outside the room. A door softly creaking open from across the house. It sounded intentional, like they were trying to open it as quietly as possible. I sat up in my bed and looked at the door as I listened, but I didn't hear anything else. After a minute, I got up and went to the bedroom door, cracking it open just enough to see through down the hallway. I could see the dim glow of the porch light lighting up the area where the front door was, indicating that the front door was partially open. I carefully and quietly closed my door and locked it, then moved to the back of the room and quietly called the police. In the middle of the phone call, I heard a creak right outside the bedroom door, and when I looked at the bottom, I could see the outlined shadow of someone standing there. I immediately stopped talking, waiting for them to walk away before continuing to report to the operator. Thankfully, nothing else seemed to happen as I waited for the officer to get there. They were gone by then, but everything showed that someone had been inside, including shoe prints all over the place. So there was no doubt, even to the cops. While I, for some reason, had my mind set on it being the Airbnb host, they didn't find anything to support that other than the front door being open without any struggle. There's also not much to say on whether they had been inside the house while I was gone during the day, with nothing missing though, and them coming back only once I was there. I think their intentions had to do with me. It still haunts my thoughts, wondering what could have happened, and if they are out there still trying. 4 years ago, I rented an Airbnb to stay in for the holidays. I was seeing my family for the week of Christmas, so I got a place that was just a few miles away. When I arrived on December 20th, everything was exactly as I thought it was. The place was a very regular house in a very normal neighborhood. Overall, I was satisfied. I'd gotten there around 6:00 on that first day though, and I didn't feel like going out to see anyone until I'd gotten a good night's rest. So I stayed in and relaxed for the rest of the night watching some TV and even getting a little bit of work done as well. I got in bed just before 10 and fell asleep, but in the middle of the night, I slowly woke to a noise coming from downstairs. I was still half asleep and didn't even check the time, but it sounded like a few small thumps against the wall coming from somewhere in the house. As I listened to the noises, I didn't really feel worried or anything, but rather just thought that it was the house making these sounds. I only stayed awake for a minute before drifting into sleep again, and I don't recall waking up any other times during the night. By morning, I had forgotten and didn't even think about those noises I was hearing again. I was pretty sure it was just the A unit or something anyway. I let my family know I'd made it into town, and we got our plans set for dinner at their place. I relaxed at the Airbnb for the whole morning and afternoon until I was ready to head out. I grabbed my bag and keys, then walked up to the front door to exit the house, but when I opened it, I was face to face with a man standing right in front of me on the porch. It completely caught me off guard, and I just stood there looking at him for a second before even saying anything. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man didn't knock or ring the doorbell, which made me start thinking of how long he could have been standing there for, and just why he was here to begin with. He didn't respond to my question though, and instead just nodded, then walked away. I watched him go down to the sidewalk and just continue walking down the street until he was gone. I can't see any situation where this wouldn't be strange and creepy. Why was he at the Airbnb, and for how long was he standing there without knocking? I made sure the place was locked up, then drove to my parents' house for dinner with the family. I brought up the situation as an interesting story, and everyone else seemed to think it was just as creepy as I thought. Dinner was still nice, and we had plenty of other great conversations catching up on life and everything. But that whole night, I couldn't stop thinking about that man and if my things I'd left at the Airbnb were going to be stolen or something. I ended up leaving the dinner get-together around 9 and getting back to the Airbnb 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door, looking around for any obvious signs of someone having been there while I was gone, but I didn't see anything. I unlocked the door and stepped in. I walked down to the end of the hallway and into the kitchen, dropping my keys and bag on the counter, but then there was a sudden thump. It was just the same as the ones I'd heard the previous night, but now that I was downstairs, it was far louder and clearly coming from one side of the house. I slowly stepped into the room near where the sound was coming from, but then the thump came again, from a door right next to me. I jumped back, getting a surge of adrenaline, and then, after staring at the door for a few seconds, I could hear the faint sound of heavy breathing from the other side. I grabbed my keys and ran for my car. I still didn't know exactly what was going on, but I was not going to stay to find out on my own. I called 911 and waited for them to arrive. When they did, I watched them go in and search for a few minutes. Then they came out and told me something horrifying. The door the person was behind was the garage door, which showed signs of distress from the person likely trying to break the lock and get inside. Unknown to me, there was a side door connected to the garage that led outside, which had been left unlocked by whoever had stayed here before me. I didn't ever plan to use the garage, so I never checked it. Whether the man I'd seen on the porch was the same person that was in the garage is unknown. But just knowing that I was asleep while someone was right below me trying to break into the house is terrifying. What they were trying to achieve after breaking in, we have no way of knowing. Obviously, after that though, I went and stayed at a hotel for the rest of the week. But I still find myself thinking about that situation even 4 years later.